Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. CEO pay levels have decreased in many of Australia's listed companies, but bonus payments have become the norm, according to new research from the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors. The study also reveals that over the past year, a CEO is more likely to lose their job than their bonus. Realised pay for ASX100 CEOs fell marginally in the last fiscal year, with the median dropping a touch to $3.93 million. That's the lowest level in 10 years, according to the ACSI study. But CEOs are benefiting from bonuses. In the ASX100, CEOs received a median bonus of about 2/3 of the maximum potential. Only 2 CEOs didn't take home a bonus last financial year. Ed John is the Executive Manager Stewardship at ACSI, the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors. Ed, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Nice to be back.
What are your key takeouts from this year's survey?
Well, I think you touched on the introduction, really the fact that pay levels have dipped in terms of the realised pay for top 100 CEOs. But there is that emerging concern around bonuses and bonus culture, because a high level of bonuses are still being awarded. You know, the standard outcome is about 66% of maximum for a top 100 CEO. So there is concern that there's a culture emerging where it's almost becoming an everyone wins a prize conversation, rather than the expectation, I think, for many investors that bonuses are really about excellent performance, not just turning up.
So I'll jump into bonuses in a moment. Just a couple of things. You measure realised pay. Just explain what realised pay is.
Yeah, realised pay is very important because we look at both the cash elements of CEO pay as well as the value of shares that have been awarded to CEOs. So it's more like what they're actually receiving. The challenge in pay reporting, which you've probably picked up when you open a company's annual report, it's very complex. There's a lot of noise in there. There's a lot of estimates about the future in there. So in our study, realised pay looks at what's actually received, cash and shares, and trying to cut through that complexity.
So does that mean someone who's issued shares as a sort of final payment, that's captured in this as well?
That's right. When those are received by the CEO. So if there are still performance conditions attached to those, we don't count it. But when they're received, when they're effectively available to the CEOs, when we count them.
Yes. Okay. So let's talk. Well, again, we will get to bonuses, but CEO pay levels are down or have leveled. I mean, let's say they're flat. Why is that?
Well, I think the greater scrutiny from investors, I think greater diligence from Australian boards has played a big factor in recent years. We've also seen a pretty significant level of shareholder opposition. So last year in the ASX 300, there were 41 first strike votes from shareholders. So effectively a large number of shareholders voting no on CEO pay. So we think there is a cumulative impact of that sort of focus and that sort of work on bonus outcomes.
That's a good thing, isn't it? I mean, shareholders should be more vocal. I mean, they should have their say, about CEO pay and that type of thing. It just seems that the activist shareholders seems to be having a moment in the sun, at least in Australia.
Well, I think we're actually moving from the activist shareholder to the active shareholder in terms of, when we see this with small retail investors or the Australian Shareholders Association, we see it from asset managers and see it from superannuation funds, that being active, engaging with AGMs and obviously voting shares has become a really important part of the landscape. And I think it's one reason that the numbers in the Australian market around CEO pay actually differ quite significantly from other markets where it feels like things have really spun out of control.
Okay. And your members, ACSI's members, so kind of the big end of town, I suppose for smaller shareholders like me, in a sense, I rely on the big end of town to make some of these judgments. If I look at an annual report, it's actually hard to understand what's going on, number one. But then if, be it a proxy group or a large shareholder actually says, hold on, I'm worried about that, then me as a retail shareholder, I tend to follow the leader a bit. So to me, there seems to be a bit of a responsibility that your members have to be active in what they're doing.
That's true. But I'd also say for individual shareholders, there's a lot of, again, research out there. There's just that broad experience of how has this company performed for me, either in my individual portfolio, for an institution, how it's performed in the broader portfolio. And I think it's a good question, do bonus outcomes actually reflect that performance has this management team and this company delivered, for me over a 1, 3 or 5 year horizon, that's actually a pretty good window in. If you combine that perspective and obviously look at what the outcomes are, it's not a bad starting point, and you certainly don't have to be a remuneration boffin.
Stay with me, Ed. We'll be back in a minute. I'm speaking to Ed John, Manager, Stewardship at the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors. Let's talk about bonuses then. In the top 100 companies, only 2 CEOs didn't get a bonus. The median bonus, 66.3% of the maximum potential. Should bonuses be paid for company CEOs who underperform? If the market's up 8 or 9% last year, should anyone whose total shareholder return is less than that, should they be getting bonuses?
It's hard to comment without knowing the individual company's circumstances, but I think generally speaking, you touch on something so important that, really it's about outperformance or strong performance. Some companies might be in a challenged industry or, going through a transformation, so it could be quite context specific. But in general, I think most approaches would be that it's about, performing above and beyond, not just, delivering a basic outcome.
And should that be judged? I know in your release you talk about 5-year total shareholder return, and Mick Farrell, the head of ResMed, his realised pay is massive. It's 48 million, but over 5 years, his total shareholder return per annum is 19%, which is, I think, by any measure, a very strong outcome. It's hard to compare apples and apples here because we're talking about 1 year's pay and a 5-year total shareholder return. But is that kind of how we should be measuring it?
We just include that as a comparison point. So again, comes down to the individual company. I guess the investor lenses may be different to, if you ask the person in the street or in any conversation, people have different views about how much is too much and quantum. It's a bit like how much, footy players or film stars or others are paid. You'll get various views on it. We include the performance numbers just as a test to see how do those numbers actually compare with, the shareholder experience. And, we have had situations over time where you have some large numbers, but they're actually attached to, quite amazing performance from companies. So if you have, 50, 100, 150%, total return over a period, sort of no surprise that those share-based payments actually come out with high numbers. It's probably the situations where the numbers are flat or negative on the performance side, but very large in the pay column that really draws the investor focus.
So in another example, and I don't particularly want to pick on the company itself, but News Corp, its boss, Robert Thomson, number 2 on the list, its return over 5 years, about 8%. But News Corp operates in a very different sector to ResMed, who's Mick Farrell, the healthcare sector, to the number 3 is Goodman Group, which is a booming sector for the industrial operators. It's kind of a bit tricky then to say, well, hold on, Robert Thomson from News Corp, you shouldn't earn that much money. It's the fact that he's kept it going in such a tough industry, maybe he does deserve it.
Exactly right. And I think really going back to that core focus where it's about the individual company and its context. So it's hard to generalize or pull one CEO out without digging into that context. Interestingly, the top 2 CEOs are US-based. So I think over time we have seen that difference in pay culture. And as I said earlier, I think in the Australian market, probably the greater scrutiny, the more diligent work of boards has seen, CEO pay probably more aligned to shareholder experience. In places like the US, for instance, we've seen some recent research that shows that, average CEO pay is about 200 times the average worker salary in many companies. And you might have seen the recent headline with Elon Musk and sort of, a CEO pay outcome in the billions, billions with a B. Again, a very different experience in the US market.
I want to come back to whether everyone deserves a bonus. And I think that's a bottom line for many of we shareholders. If my CEO hasn't performed well, particularly if my CEO has left a company for some sort of reason, do they, in your view and ACSI's view, do they deserve a bonus? Shouldn't we not be giving 98 out of 100 top ASX companies? Shouldn't be more who aren't getting bonuses?
Yeah, I think we want to see it become more at risk. I mean, it's called at risk in annual reports, but there's a question mark in some of these companies as to whether or not it is at risk. So we would like to see that number shift over time. And in some ways, it's having a culture which effectively says it's actually okay for a CEO to get a zero outcome or a low outcome. That shouldn't be seen as a failure. We should see that, difference in outcomes over time. And that statistic about you're more likely to be fired than to receive zero on your short-term incentive is a concern. In some ways, it would be better to see zeros or lower numbers more often, but perhaps better retention of people.
Fair enough. Ed, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thanks, Sean.
That was Ed John, Executive Manager, Stewardship at ACSI. This is the Fear and Greed business interview. Remember, this is general information only. You should always seek professional advice before making investment decisions. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, a business news for people who make their own decisions. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.